Okay, well, we can begin. Be who you are and be that well. I suspect, at least right now, at present time, that's one of the most popular of Salesian quotations. You see it on banners in oblate schools, visitation schools, oblate parishes. And that sentence is interpreted in a number of ways, some more profound than others. Especially for high school students, it can give them the positive message that they don't have to be, or pretend to be, someone other than themselves in order to please other people. And that can be a very healthy perspective on life. On the other hand, kids can also read it as confirming their instinct just to be satisfied with where they are at life in the present moment, and not try to improve or grow. And that's obviously not what St. Francis de Sales meant, nor is it a good perspective for young people to have. And actually, the whole quotation reads, "Be who you are and be that well, so as to give glory to the master craftsman whose handiwork you are." And I think that's much closer to that first interpretation that I told you about. It accepts a person's reality while still encouraging growth and development. And I'm going to have to pause because this chair is collapsing on me.
Okay. Here, let me pull this out.
Well, I just need another chair. That's all right.
Okay. I think what, you didn't have it, I think you didn't have it.
No, it's collapsing there.
Oh, okay. Well, you're going to take this heavy chair, okay? Well, this is going to go out in the trash. One down. Sending him a message.
This one should hold me.
Yeah, that's better.
We can make comments about the posterior.
No. That's good.
Okay, I wanted to start with that quotation because it seems to me to set a direction for our reflections this morning. I would like to reflect on your vocation as consecrated or associate members of the DeSales Secular Institute. Or to put it in Francis' words, you are members of the Institute. How can you be that reality well? What does the Lord and His Church ask of you? As I hope most of you know, secular institutes are a very recent development in the Church. Well, actually, I think that anything that happened during my lifetime is a very recent development, even if it was 71 years ago now. It was 1947 when Pope Pius XII issued his apostolic constitution, Pro Vita Mater Ecclesia. Remember that name, because I'm going to be referring to it. Pro Vita Mater Ecclesia. And that's the document that gave official church recognition and approval to the phenomenon of institutes of lay people that had risen in Europe, especially in reaction to the anti-clerical and anti-church movements of the 19th and early 20th century. In Pro Vita Mater Ecclesia, this foundational document for secular institutes, the Pope recognized that these institutes were designed, and I quote, to follow the evangelical counsels in the world and to be free to take on those imperative tasks of charity from which, in those iniquitous times, the religious communities were practically debarred. And as one of the religious congregations that were expelled from France by the government in 1904, we oblates are very aware of the sort of environment that Pius XII was describing. It's how we ended up in countries other than France, including the United States. The Pope also recognized that such secular institutes could perform essential evangelical service in the world, especially in post-war Europe. It's then no coincidence that Father Franz Reisinger, whose Salesian sisters started as a discussion group in Vienna in 1939, formed it into a secular institute in the 1940s. And it was officially recognized as a secular institute under episcopal jurisdiction in 1964. In the past 50 years, popes have written about secular institutes. Saints Paul VI and John Paul II in particular have offered in-depth reflections. And I must apologize, I had printed out a selection of those documents and it's sitting very nicely on my computer desk at home. So I'll send it out by email. Both those popes saw in secular institutes a powerful and radical response to Vatican II's call for Catholics to be holy even as they are involved in the world. Their various statements give us an ever clearer view of what secular institutes are and how important they are in the Church. Drawing from what the popes have written, Marcia Vinci, the president of the United States Conference of Secular Institutes, has named 3 essential qualities of any secular institute. She writes, consecration, secularity, and mission are the words that define our call, belonging to God and reaching out to our neighbors for the sake of sanctifying the world. Consecration, secularity, and mission. These 3 characteristics are a good starting place to reflect on your identity as members of the DeSales Secular Institute. Consecration would seem to have the most obvious meaning. For full members, you express your consecration through your vows and practice of chastity, poverty, and obedience. And I found it interesting and significant that for professed members of secular institutes, of those 3 evangelical counsels, chastity, poverty, and obedience, only chastity needs to be expressed as a vow. In some institutes, poverty and obedience can be expressed in a simple promise. The reason should be pretty clear. Evangelical chastity, the renunciation of marriage and all genital sexual activity, goes to the very core of our identities. We can lose our possessions, even our freedom, and still remain basically who we are. But when we are created by God as male and female human beings, we are male and female to the core. And everything we do, every relationship we have, reflects to a greater or lesser extent our sexual identity. And so, radically restricting our sexuality to chaste, non-genital expressions is a profound way of consecrating our whole person. The vow and practice of celibate chastity, together with the vows of poverty and obedience, are both a mode of total consecration and a sign to the world of God's overwhelming love for his people. By freely vowing chastity, poverty, and obedience, those of you who make that profession are making a conscious and deliberate decision that you're going to focus your lives more consciously on obeying the will of God and dedicating yourselves to carrying out the mission he has entrusted to you as a member of the Salesian Institute. On the 25th anniversary of Pro Vita Mater Ecclesia, Paul VI developed these ideas when he wrote, "Your consecrated life in the spirit of the evangelical counsels means that you belong inseparably to Christ and the Church, that you are permanently and profoundly intent on the pursuit of holiness, and that you are fully aware that, when all is said and done, it is Christ alone who brings about by his grace the redemption and transformation of the world. It is deep down in your hearts that the world becomes something consecrated to God. If that is how you live, then it is quite certain that the mutual understanding and feeling between you and the world will not become worldliness or naturalism, but will tell the world that Christ loves us and has been sent forth to us by the Father. Your consecration is the root of hope, which must always support you, even when visible results are scanty or non-existent. Rather than by visible good works, your life is fruitful for the world, above all, through the love of Christ, which has impelled you to make the gift of yourselves in a life that will give witness to him in the conditions of everyday life. For those of you who are associates, it's through your active commitment to the DeSales Secular Institute that you consecrate yourselves. And although your consecration is not as absolute nor as public as professed members, it's nonetheless real. In his apostolic exhortation, Vita Consecrata, Pope John Paul II explicitly recognized the value of your sharing in the spirituality and mission of a secular institute. By becoming an associate, going through formation and committing yourself to participate in institute activities, such as today's Day of Recollection, you too are making yourself available to the mission of the Institute, and you benefit, as professed members do, from the shared experience of Salesian spirituality. And whether you are professed members or associates, you're called to live an evangelical life in a secular world. Since the official recognition of secular institutes, popes have made it abundantly clear that every one of them has an apostolic mission. Pius XII wrote, "The whole life of a member of a secular institute, sacred to God by the profession of perfection, must become an apostolate, so continuous and holy, with such sincerity of mind, interior union with God, generous self-forgetfulness and courageous self-denial, such love of souls as to nourish, unceasingly renew, and outwardly express the spiritual reality within. This apostolate of one's whole life is so deeply and sincerely experienced in the secular institutes as to give the impression that, with the help and guiding wisdom of divine providence, the thirst for souls and zeal for their salvation have not only happily given occasion for a consecration of life, but have largely imposed their own way and form upon it, in a way which could not have been predicted to have created and met a need which is not confined to a specific apostolate, but is a new general way of consecrated life. Not only is this apostolate something that happens in the world, but it may almost be said to grow out of the world. Its existence is in professions, activities, forms, places, circumstances of a secular nature, and so it must remain. The need to have dedicated men and women living in the world, but dedicated to promoting the kingdom of God, was the initial impetus for the formation of secular institutes and their recognition by Pius XII. In formally recognizing the canonical, official, structure of secular institutes, he wrote, "The effectiveness of institute life in the Christian renewal of families, of secular professions, of society in general, through people's daily contact from the inside of the secular scene, with lives perfectly and dedicated to God's sanctifying work in them, is obvious. These institutes also open the way to many forms of apostolate and service in times, places, and circumstances from which priests and religious are excluded by the nature of their calling, or which for other reasons are not accessible for them. As members of a secular institute, you do what we religious and we priests are not able to do." The apostolic nature of your vocation also caught the attention of Paul VI and John Paul II. Paul VI wrote, "You are in the world, but not of it, but for it." Our Lord taught us to find in this little play on words both his and our mission for the salvation of the world. Never forget that as members of a secular institute, you have this mission in the modern world. The world needs you today. It needs, in the world itself, pathfinders to salvation to Christ. You are, in fact, lay people whose open profession of Christianity is a constructive force, supporting both mission and structure, giving life to the charity, the spiritual life of the diocese, and especially of Catholic institutions. You are lay people who can know at first hand, better than others, the needs of the church on earth. And perhaps you are better placed to see its defects. Remarkable phrase. That was 70 years ago. These you do not take as an opportunity for biting, ungracious criticism, an excuse for standing aloof, a disdainful elite. Rather, they only serve to bring out in you a greater love, a humbler and more filial service as sons and daughters coming to her aid. And the DeSales Secular Institute website describes the specific nature of your mission. You are called to continue the work of caring for souls that St. Francis de Sales began. You strive to emulate his extraordinary goodness and calm, tact and respect, unselfishness and loving willingness to lead souls to God. As Salesians, you courageously accept the responsibility of spreading and defending the faith. That says to me that each of you has the obligation to look for opportunities of intentionally spreading the good news of the gospel by the way you live your lives, as well as in various interactions and decisions you make in your lives. Don't just presume that they're going to come along. As members of a secular institute, look for them. Search them out. It's not enough to be good people. You've accepted a call to make a difference in the world. Be faithful to that call. The third term is also pretty obvious. You're members of a secular institute. Secular means that although you do not adopt many of the values of the world around you, nevertheless you minister and work and live in that world. The secular nature of your life is what distinguishes members of a secular institute from religious. For those of us who are members of religious orders or congregations, community is a major component of our lives. Most of us, live in community with other members of our congregation. And those who, for pastoral reasons, live by themselves, do so in obedience to a superior. The work we do most often is done at the direction, and in any case with the approval of the congregation, often in the person of a superior. As religious, we live and work in the context of a community of our brothers or sisters. Well, as members of a secular institute, that's not your experience. You find your own jobs, your own living arrangements. Often, professed members live by themselves. Obviously, your job, your home, your style of life are expected to be an expression of the mission of the institute and the poverty to which you've committed yourself. Although obedience is a major commitment for professed members and associates, it's practiced very differently from the obedience of avowed religious. Instead of looking to a superior for direction regarding the apostolate, for a member of the DeSales Secular Institute, quote, obedience reminds us that we are to be like little children before our Heavenly Father, who tenderly guides all who submit to His will. It includes fidelity to our personal vocation as a member of the Secular Institute of St. Francis de Sales, as well as faithfulness to the Roman Catholic Church. You are, obedient to your Salesian way of life, set out in your constitution and spiritual directory, your rule which guides you in your everyday lives. To state what I presume is as an obvious point, your secularity is not meant to be a watered-down form of religious consecration. Secular institutes are not refuges for those who can't hack the demands of life in a religious congregation and order. Not at all. The Church recognizes this life as a member of a secular institute, as a different and equally valid form of consecrated life. And as a matter of fact, the demands of living an authentically consecrated life in a secular institute can be much more demanding than life in a religious community. The responsibility of finding appropriate work and carrying it out in a manner congruent with your vocation, dealing with the loneliness that can come when one not only lives alone, but lives a life that is countercultural to so much of what surrounds her, the lack of understanding of so many in society, and even in the Church, as to what secular institutes are all about. These and other realities can call members of a secular institute to an authentic and painful dying to self that is so much a part of consecrating one's life to Christ. And yet, members of a secular institute make the commitment to live such a radically Christian life in the midst of the world, because they understand that only in that way can they fulfill their crucial role in the world. As Cardinal Hamer, writing on behalf of Pope John Paul II, put it, the important and determining point which has constantly been evidenced, even if not well understood, is the secularity. The members of a secular institute live in the world. They work for the sanctification of the world, and they do so from within the world. Such sanctification is contained in the world itself and should come about from within the world rather than from outside it. Now, what I've been saying so far is, for the most part, common to all secular institutes. But you are members of the DeSales Secular Institute. It shares many of the characteristics in common with other institutes, but also has its distinctive Salesian flavor. What makes you distinct from other secular institutes is your commitment to live the spirituality of St. Francis de Sales, wherever the Lord has placed you, in a way that proclaims the good news of the gospel. To quote again from the DeSales Secular Institute website, you are called to continue the work of caring for souls which St. Francis de Sales began. You strive to emulate his extraordinary goodness, calm, tact, and respect, unselfishness, and loving willingness to lead souls to God. As Salesians, you courageously accept the responsibility of spreading and defending the faith. Salesian spirituality is an obvious fit for the member of any secular institute, and so it's especially so for members of the DeSales Secular Institute. In some of the best-known words from St. Francis de Sales' Introduction to the Devout Life, and I quote, "A different exercise of devotion is required of each, the nobleman, the artisan, the servant, the prince, the young girl, and the wife, and furthermore, such practice must be modified according to the strength, the calling, and the duties of each individual. The devotion which hinders nothing, but on the contrary, it perfects everything. And that which runs counter to the rightful vocation of anyone is, you may be sure, a spurious devotion. Everyone fulfills her special calling better when subject to the influence of devotion. Family duties are lighter, married love truer, service to our country more faithful, every kind of occupation more acceptable and better performed where that is the guide." Now, Pius XII did not quote Francis de Sales when he wrote Pro Vita Mater Ecclesia, but he might well have. Francis was writing for people living in the world who desired to live a more devout life. And while that's not limited to members of secular institutes, it certainly characterizes them. What is this spirituality that you members of the DeSales Secular Institute are to live? There have been a number of attempts to summarize Salesian spirituality, that is, the spirituality developed by Francis de Sales together with Jane de Chantal, and which he expressed especially in the Introduction to the Devout Life and the Treatise on the Love of God. At times, these summaries seem to reflect the author's predilections as much as the objective reality of the texts that were left by Francis de Sales. So Monsignor John K. Ryan, whose translations of the introduction and the treatise are among the best available to us, speaks in the classical terms of the purgative, illuminative, and unitive ways of responding to God. Father André Ravier, who wrote the best and most accessible biographies of both Francis and Jane, claims that there are three outstanding characteristics of Salesian devotion: the importance of baptismal commitment, the position of the Eucharist as the heart of the devotion, and the liberty of heart of the children of God. Some people simply summarize Salesian spirituality with the two-word phrase, "Live Jesus." Francis himself seems to do that in the final words of the Treatise on the Love of God. Well, to my mind, one of the best summaries of Salesian spirituality is to be found in Wendy Wright and Joseph Power's introduction to Francis de Sales, Jane de Chantal, Letters of Spiritual Direction. Besides the book being a treasure trove of original writings by both saints, the introduction to the book is itself a masterpiece. And in that introduction, they list 6 themes that characterize Salesian spirituality. First of all, Francis has an optimistic view of human nature. He was squarely in what is called the humanist tradition. The time in which he lived, there was a tension between the humanist and the much more pessimistic Calvinistic movements. Humanism held that humans were the highest creatures of God on earth, and humanists believed that although humankind was wounded, it was not radically corrupted by original sin. This optimism leads to several conclusions, all of which are core to Salesian spirituality. First, God is a God of love and merciful compassion. Francis believed that God loves us so much that God the Son would have become human even if Adam had not committed original sin. Next, God wants all humans to be saved. This in turn leads to the conviction that all Christians are called to holiness. Based on this view of reality, Francis, along with other Christian humanists, believed that the basic human vocation consisted in affective love of God, that's the love that we express in our prayer life, and effective love of God, the love that's expressed in love of neighbor. That combination of prayer and ministry is core to members of the Salesian Institute. You are called to your vocation to be leaven in the world. But to be so effectively, you need to have an authentic devotion, one that colors everything that you do. If you carry that devotion with you into your workplace, your families, your neighborhoods, in a way that brings a positive change to those around you, you're responding to your vocation. Even if, because of age or illness, your circle of influence is small, let your devotion brighten and warm that small circle. It's where God calls you to live at this point in your life. Christian humanists also had an appreciation for the created world and the human arts. This appreciation ran counter to the anti-materialism of the spiritual tradition around them. They believed that contemplation of beauty can lead to contemplation of God. This in turn led to a profound love for the little virtues of humility, simplicity, modesty, piety, patience, and obedience. Virtues by which you are to make the world a kinder place, a world that reflects the kindness of God. Finally, in contrast to spiritualities that tended to distrust friendships, Francis and Jane brought a very human touch to their relationships. While we try to avoid sin, we do not hide or despise our human weaknesses. Francis tells us to love our objections because they ground us in humility. They remind us that we are humans, but it is as humans that God loves us. And that human touch should characterize the way members of the DeSales Secular Institute should interact with each other, with their co-workers, indeed with everyone they encounter. Francis once claimed, "I am as human as anyone could possibly be." Certainly members of the DeSales Secular Institute should be comfortable making the same claim. The second theme that Right and Power find is that of union of oneself to the will of God. Francis teaches that perfect love consists in submitting, uniting our wills to the will of God. And in the treatise on the love of God, Francis makes clear his understanding that there is only one will of God. But he tells us that he uses the terminology of two wills as a mean of expressing a complex, transcendent reality, the will of God, which in its totality is beyond our ability to understand. And so, for us humans, God's will can be perceived in what God signifies, what Francis calls the signified or expressed will, through his commandments, counsels, or even tested inspirations. Or God's will can be expressed in what Francis calls the will of God's good pleasure, or God's permissive will, accepting God's will as we perceive it in the events of our life, whether they are pleasant or painful. Now that doesn't mean simply accepting what is. Sometimes it means accepting the necessity and the discomfort of confronting something that's wrong. And they may well be what God is calling you to do as part of this secular institute. The significance of Francis' insight becomes clear when one's trying to discern God's will in the midst of a changing, sometimes uncooperative world. For God's will, he felt, was known not only in the promptings and dreams of one's heart, that's one type of the signified will of God, but also in the present, often painful reality in which one lives, not only in the how it should be, but in the way it is. The will of God's good pleasure is that we are called to accept. Is sometimes between these two expressions of God's will, where moral choice, loving surrender, and authentic human life are discerned. As members of the DeSales Secular Institute, you're called to unite yourself to both the signified and the permissive will of God, and to do so in every situation where you find yourself. That means being moved to do that something extra that you might be inspired to do. But it also means dealing with disappointment or frustration without sulking or complaining. The third theme is a development of Francis' conviction that a devout life can be lived in the world. As we saw above, Francis rejected a spirituality that called on lay people to live as though they were monks or nuns. In its place, Francis offered a spirituality that was both contextual and relational. God's will is to be found in the everyday activities of life, doing ordinary things extraordinarily well, and especially in the relationships that we have with families, friends, and all those with whom we come in contact. Salesian friendship is marked by what Francis calls cordiality. It's expressed in qualities like affection and affability. And that's not simply enduring other people's personality quirks. Sometimes that can be a real challenge. Sometimes that's called for. But it means treating those we encounter in a friendly way, respecting their human dignity as children of God. Indeed, as Francis modeled in his relationship with Jane de Chantal, not only is a deep, profound, and intimate friendship no barrier to spiritual growth, but in fact, it was precisely in the midst of that friendship with all the powerful dynamics of interaction between male and female that they both learned what it was to make Jesus live fully. And they extended themselves in friendship to a wide circle of intimates, giving credence to the Pauline assertion that friendship is the bond of perfection. And so, in the introduction to the devout life, Francis emphasizes the importance of good friendships. They help us on the way to salvation. Francis' understanding of the importance of human relationships lived in a blessed way had a major significance for the visitation. Originally, he did not want them to have vows. He just wanted them to have a vow of charity. And he used to tell them, we have no bond but the bond of love. But that's the bond of perfection. That means, as members of the DeSales Secular Institute, you are called to be nice people. Now that may sound trite or simplistic, but look around. We're not overwhelmed with nice people in our world. We used to have, we had a priest who's now deceased, and certainly one of the holiest men I ever knew, Father Manning Moore. And he was a chaplain in the prison down in Washington, D.C. And he used to say, don't underestimate being nice. I work in a place where there are not many nice people. Let me tell you, being nice is important. You can be a candle shining in the darkness. That can be part of your apostolate. You are also called to be friends with each other. Although you do not live together, you're called to be bound together by the bond of love, just as those first visitandines were. In the fourth theme of Salesian spirituality, the classical spiritual concept of detachment or indifference is seen as the source of true liberty of spirit. Detachment or indifference means letting go of lesser motivations and being as open as possible to whatever God is asking at a particular moment. Francis taught Jane and other people he directed, all through love, nothing through fear. Freedom is essential for love. As a spiritual director, Francis' detachment from his own agenda allowed him to respect the individual's discernment of God's will, unless it was clearly in opposition to the revealed will of God. This was particularly evident in Francis' practice not to insist on any one particular prayer form. When he met Jane, Jane was attracted to a very non-discursive, non-intellectual form of prayer. Something similar to, I think, what we experience in centering prayer. And originally Francis, who was taught by the Jesuits and taught to meditate in a very formal way, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and step 5, was, was very cautious of that. But as he got to know Jane and see the effect of her style of prayer in her life, he came to recognize the value of it. And I think that really affects what he ended up writing about prayer in the Treatise of God. He learned it from her experience. On the other hand, The Christian who's growing in the love of God discovers the freedom of holy indifference by not clinging to one's own agenda, and especially by being responsive to the often unforeseen demands and promptings of charity towards one's neighbor. It's in the symbolism of the human heart that the fifth theme of Salesian spirituality is expressed. It's also where Live Jesus is best developed. For Francis, the heart was the seat of both intellect and will, the affective and intellectual core of a person. And Francis was firmly convinced that the way to effect a personal conversion was to begin with a change of heart, and only then let exterior change flow from that interior conversion. And so in the third book of the introduction, he instructs Philothea how to maintain her heart devoted to the Lord, even in the midst of worldly activities, which at that time included court balls and theater. Delving deeper into the symbol, Francis sees the pulsating heart as a symbol of the dynamic interplay between God and the human person. Like a heart pumping blood through the body, we draw in God's goodness and life, and we breathe forth his praise. Finally, Francis realized that in his dealings with people, heart speaks to heart. The tongue speaks only to the ears. He demonstrated well that people are attracted to the Lord more by a loving, enthusiastic personality than by the persuasive force of intellectual argument. After all, martyrdom of love occurs in the heart. The emphasis on the heart, on emphasizing on what is occurring in our heart rather than our exterior actions, has three consequences. First, because it is interior, it can be lived in any circumstances or lifestyles, and it will fit in and improve the circumstances of that life. Secondly, because the meaning and value of our actions come from within, they cannot be evaluated from the outside, nor according to their seeming importance. Third, the hidden life of the heart must be constantly fostered and cultivated by prayer. This emphasis on the heart, the interior, is the basis of Francis' way of finding God wherever you are. And as members of the DeSales Secular Institute, what characterizes your life, your work as Salesian, is most often not what you do exteriorly, but the devotion in your heart when you do it. The final theme that Right and Power find in Francis de Sales is connected with the first, the importance of the little virtues. There's no official list of what those virtues are, but certainly we would include gentleness, obedience, humility, simplicity, and patience. And it is, in fact, in the practice of the little virtues that Francis suggests we find true holiness. And of all of them, perhaps the most Salesian is gentleness. In another of his well-known statements, he says, "There's nothing so gentle as true strength, nor so strong as true gentleness." And his most often used scriptural quotation was Matthew 11:29-30. "Take my yoke on your shoulders and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble of heart." It is in the imitation of the gentle, humble Jesus that Francis would have the Christian walk. It's in the practice of, French word is douceur, literally sweetness, but perhaps better translated as gentleness or graciousness, humility and simplicity, that Francis would suggest we find our way to the Lord. Francis makes the point in the introduction that occasions of practicing heroic virtues are rare. One of the advantages of the little virtues is that there are daily occasions of practicing them. Serious practice of the little virtues is a significant practice of mortification, and it is a mark of holiness. Again, the connection to your vocation in the DeSales Secular Institute should be obvious. Wherever you are, whatever you do, your practice of the little virtues makes you a holier person and brings the light of God's love with you. Be who you are and be that well. As members of the DeSales Secular Institute, you've dedicated yourself by vows or your commitment to spread the good news of the gospel as leaven in our world, and to do so in the spirit of St. Francis de Sales. That's who you are. That's what you are called to do. Francis de Sales would ask you to do it well. So those are my thoughts, and I'm open to any questions you might have.